Well, Steve might think that. I doubt it. Well,
it's been good so far.
Well, that's good. That's good. If I get Steve to approve of a history class, I'm happy. That's the bar. If Steve's happy with the history class, all is good. All right, well, welcome back in. We are continuing down the line today. You'll notice that we have a little bit of a difference in the format for today, and that is that we only got one person that we're talking about today. And as much as we could teach a whole class or more on all of these individuals that we've been talking about so far, especially if we dive into what they actually wrote down, rather than just doing biographical stuff. I took an entire seminary course just on Athanasius, and we still didn't cover everything. We covered a lot, but we did not cover everything. So Athanasius is definitely one of those figures that looms large over the early church. And so we're going to give him his life, some of his works, and that kind of thing, kind of the full treatment. As I said, really Athanasius, not him specifically, but with Athanasius comes this turning point in early church history, right? It's where we draw the line between, the people before Nicaea and the people after Nicaea. Well, Athanasius is the Nicaea guy, if you will. Now, there are hundreds of bishops at Nicaea. There are many very prominent theologians at this time, but Athanasius far outshines them all. By the way, before we get there, I think I've talked about this before, but you definitely know of at least one other bishop who was at Nicaea. He was the bishop of Myra. Anyone know who the bishop of Myra was in 325?
Nicholas?
St. Nicholas. That's right. Santa Claus was at the Council of Nicaea, right? I think I told you that he...
Muhammad Ali.
Right, oh yeah, because he did get thrown in jail for punching Arius in the face at one point, because he spoke down to the divinity of Christ, right? And he just couldn't take the blasphemy. So so lots of lots of big names at the Council of Nicaea, lots of very important people, but as I said, far and above them all, the premier theologian of this era is Athanasius. No question, all right? But before we dive into him, is there any lingering questions, thoughts from last week or previous weeks? Good to see Jay. We got a handout for you somewhere.
Okay.
I don't know where the staff is. There they are.
Like a puzzle trying to find you.
Oh, that's right. Because I don't mute the hallways because they're little dials and they're kind of a pain to readjust. The slider's easy, so it's not anyway. But at least we know it's happening.
Yeah.
Right? So, any lingering questions, thoughts, comments, concerns from anything before Nicaea? All right, you all will be happy to know, as my early church history class, that my newsletter article for this February, I was texted this morning a very gentle and wonderful reminder that I still haven't written it. It's the 29th. And so basically, I just quoted out of one of the apostolic works. So I wrote a little intro, boom, put it in, sent it off to Emily, and she's now happy with me again. So, but anyway, so if you want to see some of this early church stuff in action, right, be on the lookout for that newsletter article. As I said, just as a review, we've covered our apostolic fathers. These are the guys right after the apostles. We moved through the apologists into the ante-Nicene fathers. Today, as I said, we're getting into the Nicene fathers, specifically Athanasius. Before we get going, Athanasius is probably a name that you're familiar with, especially if you spent any significant time in this class before. So before we dive into this individual and what's going on with him, what do you guys know about Athanasius?
Well, when you used to have that book club, we read one of his books.
Did we read on the Incarnation?
Yeah. It was actually quite fascinating.
I learned something about On the Incarnation today that blew my mind and made me a little upset. And so, but I'm going to hold off on that. But no, I often say that if you want to read something from the early church, the best place to start is Athanasius on the Incarnation. It is a fantastic book. And if you get a more modern translation that you have to pay for, right? Because all this is in the public domain, but it's all in like Shakespearean style English in the public domain. So if you go to the newer stuff, it's really easy to read. Fantastic. Yeah. Okay, good.
Now relate connection to the Athanasian Creed.
Right. So this is what most people know about Athanasius is that, on Trinity Sunday, we confess the Athanasian Creed. That's the same name. So Athanasius must have written it. But as is the case with most things in the world, no, that's too easy. Athanasius did help to write a creed, and it was the Nicene Creed. We don't know who wrote the Athanasian Creed. We don't even really know when the Athanasian Creed was written. Our best guess is around the 600s to 700s. And so 400 years after Athanasius was dead. So why do you think we call it the Athanasian Creed? If he didn't write the thing, he was long dead before it was written. Any guesses?
Reflective of his theology?
That's the best guess, and I don't mean that that's why the reason we think it most, but that's the better answer. It might also be the case. It could be that the people who wrote it in his name and passed it off as something that he wrote. This is not uncommon in the early church. I can't remember the name of the big one, but every once in a while, if you're reading through certain books that quote a lot of church fathers, you'll see that a number of the church fathers have the word pseudo in front of them. It's because someone we know wasn't that guy wrote and put his name on the front, on the top of the page, right? And so pseudo Athanasius would be what this might be. So could be that people were trying to pass it off as something that Athanasius wrote, or whether that was it or not, it reflects the theology of Athanasius. And so that gives it clout. That's why it has the name. Yep. Good. Anything else about Athanasius that you guys know?
One here says written against the Arians. What was that?
For the Athanasian Creed?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Creed of Athanasius written against the Arians.
Oh, don't you worry. We're going to talk a lot about the Arians today.
Okay.
So, you're newer to this class, so you probably haven't heard that name very often, but some of them are sick of me talking about it.
Oh, okay.
Right? Yeah, there we go. Oh, I should have written it down. There's a new term I heard. It was like, it turned heretic into a title, like bishop. But anyway, it was in a Catholic source that I was reading today. And I was like, that's pretty interesting. Anyway, no, Arius is sometimes known as the arch heretic of the church.
Okay.
Yeah, big boogeyman. We don't like him. So, good. Well, let's look into who this guy actually is, right? We don't know exactly when he was born, right? Here's the broken record portion of the class, right? We don't know precisely when he was born, although we have a pretty good guess. The number I wrote down, so the number I'm going to give you is the year 296. It's somewhere between 296 and 297 or 8. So, unlike people like Polycarp, where it's like, well, we gotta guess, and it's a big window at that. No, we don't know precisely when Athanasius was born. We don't know his birth date, but we're pretty darn close on it, right? This comes up a lot. We know what day Athanasius died, right? It was May 2nd of the year 373. That's the day Athanasius died. How do we know the day Athanasius died, but we're only kind of guessing on the year he was born?
Obviously they didn't have records.
So the record keeping wasn't as good. That's a big part of it.
Well, he's famous by the time he dies.
Bingo. This happens throughout all of history, right? We know when a lot of people die, because by the time they die, they're famous and people are paying attention to them, right? When Athanasius was born, he was just a baby, right? He wasn't significant or important yet. So there weren't a whole bunch of people paying attention to the birth of Athanasius. This happens a lot. This is why in the early church in particular, we've had a lot more precise death dates than birth dates. And this goes throughout history and probably far more recent than you would expect. Even up into the 1700s, every once in a while you'll see a history book that says born, it always has a C in front, right? And then whatever the number is, right? Do you know what the C means?
Circa.
Do you know what circa means? It's a fancy college way of saying about that, right? As soon as I learned this, I put circa in as many of my undergrad papers as I could, right? It sounds good. But yeah, it just means about, right? So if we're doing that here, we'd say that Athanasius was born circa 296, right?
So he couldn't be an old man back then.
Yes. Yeah. You know, Jay, you stepped in something here. Do you already know what I'm going to be doing here? Yeah. It's this really irritating misconception, right? It's irritating to me, right? How many of you have heard something? This has nothing to do with anything here, but we're going off on it because I'm a history guy, and like I said, you stepped in.
I like history.
How many of you have heard that, like, back then the average age or the average life expectancy was 33 or something like that? Yeah. Everyone's heard that. Yeah. That is technically true, but is not practically true, right? Tom, our statistician, do you know what I'm talking about here?
Well, it's because most people die as infants.
Yeah, if you made it past...
as infants can live a lot longer.
Right, if you made it past about 12, you were as likely as anyone nowadays to make it into your 60s, at least, if not further, right? Because most of the things that killed you when you were a baby or very young, right? And a lot of people died, and so it swings the average way down, right? So average life expectancy is 33, but it's not like 33-year-olds were dying all over the place. Right. It's that there were a whole bunch of small children dying, and then a whole decent number of old people, right? And everyone throughout the middle, right? So, yes, Athanasius was still an old man. I mean, he made it almost to his 80s. So he is still an old man, right? But it's not like people walk around and it's like, oh man, this man lived 2.5 lifetimes, right? No, that's not the case.
I think he would share his birthday if he was famous.
It's possible that he didn't know. Yeah.
He didn't know his own birthday.
It's entirely possible. And by the way, this still happens. All of the people who are claiming currently to be the oldest person in the world don't know when they were born. Part of it's because they're like 110, and so that kind of clouds things, but there's no record of when they were born. They don't remember, and no one that was there is still alive, right? So it's not uncommon. Also, like, celebrating your birthday wasn't as important back then. That wasn't as big of a thing, right? But yeah, so that's like I said, this is a really common thing there.
They had written that song in.
That's right, yeah. And it hadn't been like maybe copywritten, maybe not, public domain, all that kind of stuff, right? As with most of these guys, we don't know much about his early life or his family. We know that he was born into a Christian home. We know that he had at least one brother named Philip, but that's all we know about his family. The only reasons we know that is because he writes some stuff about himself later on. He mentions these things. That he was born into a Christian family, right? So there's no big conversion moment for Athanasius. He was born as a Christian. He was this is also going to be a theme. He was a fantastically intelligent and talented young man. He was put into school, and rigorous school at that. He studied extensively in philosophy and law, but most of all, he studied, even from a very young age, theology. And he even writes and gives names of the teachers that he had, and they were prominent theologians during the most recent persecution in Alexandria. So he was learning from the top tier, cream of the crop sort of individuals. In addition to this, this will come up later in his life, we don't know when exactly or how exactly, but we do know that from his youth, he had extensive contact with a number of hermits living in Upper Egypt. the desert hermits out there. By the way, because this confused me to no end for a long time, which direction on a compass is Upper Egypt?
Oh, it's south.
It's south,
of the Nile.
because it's upriver of the Nile, right? Like I said, this really confused the daylights out of me for a long time, right? Upper Egypt is southern Egypt because it's upriver of the Nile. Before, certainly, but around the time of Athanasius' early years, there was a growing movement of religious figures that would just go out into the desert in the Upper Nile. They were known as the desert hermits. These are not the pillar people, different groups. And one of them, who we're actually going to talk about a little bit here, is credited with inventing monasticism. Although the really fun and interesting thing about this is he learned how to do the monastic thing at a nunnery. So which is basically female monks. So how this works, I'm not entirely sure. And there were other people doing the hermit thing as well that he learned from, but this is kind of how the early church goes. The really famous guy is the one that gets credited, even if he wasn't the first. But that was not Athanasius, that's someone else, which we're going to get to near the end of Athanasius' life. We'll talk a little bit about him. So Athanasius, from a very young age, is being educated classically in philosophy and law, and he's also being educated by the brightest minds in the church, both the ascetic hermits living out in the desert, as well as the prominent theologians of Alexandria, right? And if you remember, Alexandria is at this point the premier city of theology, right? With individuals like Origen that we talked about last week and a number of others, Alexandria has risen in prominence to be the center of theological thought, right? By the way, today is one of the reasons why I've been going over those 5 big cities of theological thought in the early church, right? The one that's going to play in today is not only Alexandria, of course, but also Antioch. Those are going to be our 2 main players today during the drama that is Athanasius' life. So Athanasius is an extremely talented young man, learning from the best and the brightest of the Christian world in his day. Around the age of 21, he became deacon. So he was anointed as deacon in the Church of Alexandria, and he was assigned to serve as secretary under the bishop. His bishop was Bishop Alexander. It is at this time that he wrote on the Incarnation. This is what I learned today. Athanasius wrote the most famous early church document that we're reading hundreds of years later when he was 21. And that made me feel like an underachiever, right? Athanasius probably wrote on the Incarnation at the age of 21 or 22.
People must have been smarter than him, so
there's an interesting thought here, that comment of people must have been smarter than. I'm going to talk about something that's going to sound unrelated. When I got to seminary, I remember 2 of the professors talking. They were having a conversation. It was at one of those meet and greet things. It was these 2 guys, and he found out I was a history major and that I had just read a book about Admiral Nelson, so he and I were talking about Trafalgar and Nelson getting shot in the eye and all that fun stuff. And another professor came over, so I got stuck at a table, drinking wine with these guys while they were talking about hymns, specifically. They were talking about hymns in the church. And one of them, the guy that wasn't the history guy for what it's worth, was saying it was a traditional versus contemporary hymns. And he was saying something you hear a lot, right? The hymns are just better, right? They're richer, they have better theology, they're more poignant, they're all these things, right? And the other professor said, well, yeah, I love hymns as much as the next guy. What you have to realize is that most hymns from the eras that you're getting these hymns were garbage. But you don't know any of them. Why not? because we didn't keep any of them because they weren't worth keeping, right? So we got rid of them. Meanwhile, contemporary hymns in this context, the professor was saying, there's just so much junk out there. Sure, a few of them are good, but there's just so much kind of flippant, pointless, meh music, right? The other professor's point was there's just as many good contemporary hymns as there were traditional hymns, except the traditional hymns have 1900 years from which to grab the best of the best from. Meanwhile, the modern stuff only has what we have now. And we're hearing it more, right? The same can be said for books, right? Classical books are just better, right? They're the classics than all this kind of nonsense we got blasting out of Barnes and Nobles and Amazon today. Well, there was just as much coming out back then, but you didn't keep it. In a similar sense, yes, we are talking. Everyone we're going to talk about in this class is smarter than everyone in this room by a lot, right? But that's because they're the best of the best, right? So yes, some of these guys are exceedingly intelligent, to the point where they, might be within the top 0.1% of intelligence of all time, right? But we've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years from which to grab them. There were plenty of people that were just like the rest of us. We have this kind of thing even now, right? You got Stephen Hawking and Albert Einstein and all these other just incredibly intelligent geniuses. Well, for every one of them, how many quack scientists out there, just because I use science, right? Just who don't really know what's going on and are making guesses, right? It's the same back then. That's actually part of the problem of Arianism is, we'll get to that. But not everyone back then is as smart as Athanasius is. And as I said, Athanasius is exceedingly intelligent even for his time. So at the age of about 21, Athanasius wrote On the Incarnation, which is, like I said, if you're going to read anything that I talk about from this class, make it On the Incarnation. It is a fantastic book. It has one line that we don't really like. He messed one thing up in the book, but there's a way to understand it correctly. The line he messed up, by the way, is God became man so that man might become God. No, we don't believe that. There's a way to understand it properly, even with that phrase. Likely he used the phrase, well, that kind of stuff comes up later. The phrase is extremely poetic, right? It's a nice little mirror. The best way for us to understand it is something along the lines of God became man so that we might be redeemed to God. It's more or less what he means when he says it anyway. But other than that one line, which has a footnote, like I said, right? On the Incarnation is fantastic. I would absolutely recommend reading it. And the guy wrote it when he was 21, so nothing I wrote at 21 is, I don't think anything I wrote at 21 is still around now, let alone in 13 or 1700 years, right? So at the age of 21, he starts serving as secretary under the Bishop of Alexandria, Alexander, who, for what it's worth, is not a theological slouch by any means. It just is unfortunate for him that his successor and protege was the genius of the century. Right, so he gets overshadowed exceedingly by Athanasius. And then around that time, he's writing On the Incarnation. Bill, it looks like you have a question for me. All right. Around the year 323, so 2 years after he takes up his diaconate, is when we have a guy by the name of Arius that takes his steps onto the world stage. For what it's worth, this is a good place to kind of have this conversation too. No one, not even Arius, wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to be a heretic, right? I'm going to be the arch heretic of Christianity. That's what I'm going to accomplish today, right? All of the heretics are starting out mostly from a place of trying to understand something and then getting it wrong and then not being willing to be corrected, right? Those are kind of the key steps. So Arius is a deacon as well. He's a deacon kind of in a country church outside of Alexandria. He is under the purview of Alexander, but he's way out there kind of thing. So he starts teaching. Can any of you explain to me what Arius is teaching? Or explain to Jay, right? I know, but Jay doesn't know yet. So can anyone see if they can summarize what Arius is teaching? If not, I will take over, don't worry. The key to understanding all of Arius' theology, and it's way more complicated than all this, or way more involved, I should say, it's not more complicated, is that Arius believed that the second person of the Trinity, so the Logos, Jesus, right, the Son, is still God, but not God in the same way that God the Father is God. This has a lot of implications, but the one that kind of became the catchphrase of Arianism is this line, "There was when he was not." And the idea being that the Son is not eternal like the Father is eternal. That the Son instead is the first of creation, the greatest of the Father's creations, almost equal to the Father, and then through the Son, the Father created the world. Right? Arius has a lot of Bible verses to back him up, by the way. This was a fun and irritating thing that our professor did, is he handed us some of Arius's explanations of Bible passages, and he said, "Tell me why he's wrong." And it was more difficult than you'd think it would be. One of them, I don't even know if you guys remember, this is forever ago, when I was teaching Proverbs. I think it's Proverbs 8 something, was like one of the key verses of Arianism. And it is that you were the first of my creation kind of thing. In the wisdom, I can't remember the citation specifically. What this allowed, so why? Why is Arius doing this, right? Why does he care? What this is allowing Arius to do is solve this problem, if you will, of God being involved in creation. And while that doesn't seem like a problem for us, it's because you're not ancient Greek philosophers or Neoplatonic Greek philosophers, right? This does have some echoes of Gnosticism in it, but there's this idea that was very prevalent that God could not operate in creation because that would kind of bring God down. It would sully God. The Gnostics get around this by making what are called emanations. God creates a slightly less divine being that then creates another slightly less divine being that then creates another slightly less divine being. And eventually you're far enough removed from God that you can get that emanation, is what it's called, dirty with the work of creation, right? That's more or less what Arius was doing, is he's separating God the Father from creation by one step. Additionally, it kind of makes logical sense, right? So Arius was famous. He would go down to the docks and he would talk to mothers mostly. And he would ask the mothers, he would talk to them about Jesus, and he would ask them, did you exist before your child? Well, what's the answer to that? Yeah, it's the same way with the Father and the Son. By the way, we have an answer to this. Does anyone know what it is? It's another quippy little thing you can tell to some mother on the docks, right? Were you a mother before you had your child? Well, no. And the Father is eternally the Father. That's an eternal relationship, right? So the Son, yes, in humans, parents pre-exist their children, but with God, that relationship is eternal, right? Because he wouldn't be the Father if there was no Son, right? And this is a big problem for Arius, right? Because one of the ideas is that God doesn't change. That's why he wants to separate Jesus out a little bit, right? Because God the Father in this sense can't change. So therefore, there can't be this change from not being a father to being a father. And so that's one of these places where Arius was pushed back on. Most of the arguments between the Arians and the Orthodox Christians is immeasurably more complicated than that. like I said, I was given the Arian arguments, and it was not a you go work on this on your own. It was a class of 10 or 15 fourth years that had been in these classes in the early church more than once. There were prerequisites for this, and we still struggled, right? So a lot of these arguments are very complicated in the weeds, minutiae kind of thing. But Arius and his teaching about Jesus take off. And there's a number of reasons for that. One, Arius is able to explain his teachings in very simple ways. Arius also Arius and Luther do the same thing. Arius goes to taverns and pubs and ships, right? He was a deacon in a port city. And he listens to the songs people are singing, and then he writes hymns to the tunes of those songs, right? And then the people start singing those songs, right? By the way, how many of you knew that A Mighty Fortress is written to the tune of a German drinking song? Why? Because Luther wanted the people to start singing, and they said, oh no, we can't sing in church. None of us can sing. And Luther said, you absolutely can. I hear you all from the inn every night. And they're like, well, we can sing that. I said, fine. And a lot of Luther's hymns are just drinking songs with new words on them. By the way, while we're at it, so is the Star Spangled Banner.
Oh, yeah.
I've told this story before, right? You know this one, Jay? Do you know why? Does anyone know why the Star Spangled Banner is an old British drinking song? The tune, not the words, of course. It was the first Olympics, and we weren't supposed to win anything. And this was before like CDs, and so there was a British band. And then America won, and we didn't have a national anthem. They wanted to practice it anyway, because again, we weren't expected to win anything. And so during the medal ceremony, the British band was told to just play something they knew, so they played an old drinking song. And that became the tune for the Star Spangled Banner. By the way, the high note that everyone goes crazy on, if you can't hit the note, they cut you off. That's how they knew when it was time for you to be done. History is far more crazy than you all think it is, right? But anyway, so Arius would write hymns. He had a very simple way of teaching, and it caught on. There's another societal reason Arius's teachings caught on so much. This is kind of a historical context thing. So right around this time, Rome is in chaos. Absolute and utter chaos, right? There is a massive four-way civil war going on. One of the guys who is fighting the civil war is a guy named Constantine. You probably know him as Emperor Constantine because, spoiler alert, he won, right? And does anyone else know what Constantine is extremely famous for doing right after he wins the Battle of the Milvian Bridge? It's known as the Edict of Milan. Does anyone know what it did?
Christianity.
Legal, right? Yeah, so Christianity is officially made legal. It's not made the state religion. That happens under Theodosius a number of generations later. Constantine makes Christianity legal. More significant than that is Constantine converts to Christianity, right? Now, why does that matter?
He's the boss.
Yeah.
He's the boss, right? And Bill wants a promotion, right? So what's Bill all of a sudden going to do?
Become a Christian.
You know what? These old gods, I'm not about them. I think I need to do this Christianity thing too, right? Emperor, will you come to my conversion service? Right? All that kind of stuff, right? When the emperor became Christian, huge chunks and huge swaths of the empire, basically overnight, became Christian. What does this do to the Christian populace? Well, yeah, okay, it makes it explode. Well, think about the Christians of a few decades before, right? What has every church father been under threat of this whole time? Martyrdom and persecution, right? Why don't we know when the Apostles' Creed was written? Right? Because they kept it a secret so that, right, you had to be on the inner circles, right? To be admitted into the church, you had to go through 2 years of instruction, right? it was not easy to become a Christian. And so what this means is culturally, societally, if you will, the Christians pre-Constantine were fairly well educated in the faith, right? It just took them forever to do it. And they were also extremely loyal to the faith, right? Because it was a very real risk to their life. Once Constantine converts, what happens? Well, it's okay to be Christian, so we lose the stakes, right? And we also lose that rigorous education. That drops out as well. Because the rigorous education was, this is a really bad way of putting it, it was basically a hazing ritual, right? Or a screening process, right? If you can make it through that, then we'll let you in, right? So you had to be really dedicated just to make it through the education process. Well, with Constantine, that all changes because it's not necessary for your safety anymore. And so you have a massive conversion of Christians who go from extremely dedicated and loyal to kind of nonchalant and uncommitted, right? They're there for personal benefit more than anything else, at least at first, right? And they go from highly educated to at least highly trained in what it means to be a Christian, what the beliefs of the Christians are, to pretty quick, let's get you in and out of this process sort of thing, really fast. What does that leave? Leaves this vacuum for someone like Arius to come in with a very easy to understand, very easy to connect to theology of Jesus, who Jesus is, that doesn't really, quite frankly, challenge their previous philosophical and religious views, right? It's easier for them to say, oh, God the Father stays out and is unconnected to anything, and then he has a son or an emanation or something comes out from him, and that interacts with the world. That jives with the Roman philosophical worldview and religious worldview at the time. So when Arius comes and basically supports that in an easy to understand way, people go along with it, right? So Arius and his teachings begin to spread quickly. Alexander, remember, is the Bishop of Alexandria. It's easy to remember because it's almost the same name, right? In fact, one's named after the other kind of thing. Alexander calls in Arius to a council of Egyptian bishops, right? Or what we would call Egyptian bishops, to explain himself, right? What are you teaching? What's going on? I've heard these sorts of things. You got to answer for yourself because that doesn't sound right to me, right? With the exception of two bishops present, he is unanimously condemned and is basically stripped of his position in the church. So what Arius does is he runs away and he retreats to specifically Caesarea, which is an area that is at least theologically controlled by Antioch. In Antioch, he found a much more receptive audience to his views. In fact, the bishop of Antioch, which is Eusebius of Caesarea, which is not the Eusebius that writes the church history thing. Same name, different guys. Eusebius becomes a huge proponent of Arius and his theology, right? And so now, all of a sudden, you have two of the major theological centers of Christianity with powerful and influential bishops that disagree with each other about, who Jesus is. Big deal, right? And contextually, right, again, we're going to take a step back. This is just in the wake of a massive Roman civil war, right? Why is this a huge problem? Rome is described as existing or being supported by a tripod. Have any of you ever heard this before? There are three pillars of Rome that kept Rome going. By the way, this is one of those things that's definitely worth locking away because it explains massive chunks of European history. The three pillars of the Roman Empire is the state, the political machine, if you will, which changes over the years, right? Starts out as a king, then becomes the proconsuls in the Senate during the Republic, and then becomes the emperor. So at this point, it's the emperors holding the empire together. That's pillar one. Pillar two is the army. People with the pointy things, right? They're very good at maintaining order, especially in Rome. And it's not just that, you know, the guys with the pointy things are all on the side of Rome, but military service was a huge part of Roman life. Men would join, be conscripted basically into the Roman military service when they were 16 or so, depending on their position in life. And many of them would not leave until they were 45 or older, right? So this is the military complex, as well as the fact that it's the military, formed the second major pillar of Rome. The third is religion, right? Up until Constantine, the religion was emperor worship or the gods, you know, Capitoline Hill, that kind of stuff, right? Which, by the way, is why it was such a big deal to the Romans that the Christians wouldn't burn incense to Caesar, right? In the Romans' view, they're kicking one of the pillars out, saying, I don't care about that. That's a problem to the Romans. They are not comfortable with that, right? So, three pillars of the Roman Empire. The emperor, the army, and the church. Well, what has just happened? You just had a massive four-way civil war. So Constantine, the emperor, he is emperor, and he's starting to become the pillar that he needs to be, but he's new, he's untested, and most importantly, there are still lots of people with pointy things that don't like him, right? Because they weren't on his side. So he's a pillar, but he's not very strong yet. Then you have the army. Well, again, four-way civil war. Best case scenario, huge swaths of the army are dead because they've all just killed each other. By the way, the fact that the Roman Empire lasted as long as it did is shocking because from about, 30 BC to like 800 AD, Rome, or the Roman chunks that are left, are in almost a constant state of civil war. It is wild that they're able to last as long as they do. I don't know how they do it. But anyway, the army is also not strong. In fact, the army is basically a non-functioning pillar at this point. Constantine needs to reconsolidate that. It's not there. So, what is Constantine left with? Religion, or the church, right? Okay, he has something solid. Huge parts of his empire are cool with this new Christianity thing. He now has something that he has established, at least in the people's mind, right? He has established the church. He is a major figure there. He made it okay, right? So it's supporting him back and forth. It's how it's supposed to function. It's just starting to kind of legitimize Constantine, legitimize his regime, all of that sort of thing. And then what happens a few years later? Well, the two major factions in the church go to war with each other, basically. Antioch and Alexandria start fighting. It starts as a theological debate. It is technically always a theological debate, but sometimes the theological debates were monks with very large sticks, using the sticks as their arguments on each other, right? In Alexandria, during Athanasius' lifetime, through a big portion of his lifetime, the monks were like somewhere in between the elite SWAT enforcers and like mob enforcers, right? They would literally prowl the streets with cudgels looking for Arians or for Orthodox, depending on who was in control at the time, right? To beat them up or to start riots and fights. This was a weird time, right? By the way, the Romans are really big fans. The Roman Empire is just a really long, very large mafia. Like, they really haven't changed. They had all sorts of people whose whole job was to beat people up with sticks on the street. I know. And they were like the highest office you could have in the Roman Republic was the people who beat people up with sticks. But you could only beat up the patricians, right? You couldn't beat up the plebs. It's weird.
Yeah.
It's weird. But basically what happens is right as Constantine is starting to consolidate power and get things to calm down and settle in his empire, two of his massive factions in the church go to war with each other. That's not good, because now it's not only destabilizing the one solid pillar he has, which is the church, but because he's tied himself to it, it's now destabilizing him as well. Not good. So, if you're Constantine, what do? You send a letter out to every bishop in your empire. You say, get your butts to Nicaea. We're dealing with this now. Right? That's how the Council of Nicaea begins. Constantine summons the bishops to Nicaea and says, we're going to sort this out. We're going to deal with this problem. Alexander is, the Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, right, is the bishop from Alexandria. Only bishops were allowed to speak at the council, right? If you weren't a bishop, you weren't given permission to talk, right? So Athanasius doesn't say anything at the council, but like basically everyone knows that Athanasius was writing Alexander's speeches. He was writing his treatises. This was an open, it's not even a secret. Everyone just knew this, right? Athanasius was brilliant. He couldn't talk because he he was just a deacon, right? But Alexander was the mouthpiece of Athanasius at the Council of Nicaea. Now, we're not going to get into the weeds of Nicaea because it's massive. But what comes out of Nicaea for the purposes of Arianism and this, because more things are dealt with and figured out at Nicaea than just the Arian issue. But at the Council of Nicaea, the council decides that Arius is wrong. Not just incorrect, he is heretically wrong. They produce the first two articles of the Nicene Creed. Technically, they have the third article, which you all should know by now, and the Holy Spirit. And then they have a fourth article of the Creed, which is 12 ways of saying why Arius is going to hell. Right? And I think the first line of what are known as the anathemas is, anathema is anyone who says there was when he was not, right? They're not subtle about this. They don't use his name, but they basically use his name. Actually, one of them might be, anathema is anyone who follows the teachings of Arius. I'm not 100% confident. We don't say it in church anymore. But the orthodoxy comes out on top. By the way, for the Dan Brown people out there, who aren't any of you, Constantine wanted Arius to win. Does anyone know why Constantine wanted Arius to win?
More public support.
More churches at this they were the ones winning in the populace at this point. Most churches had attached themselves to the Arian viewpoint. Constantine did not care, right? Which one was easiest on the other side of this? The Arians. There's more of them out there. And so that's who he was pulling for, if you will. Constantine knew enough to stay out of it, right? He presided over the council, but he wasn't debating or anything like that. And so, actually, I personally, I say that one of the greatest examples of the Holy Spirit working in the church outside of the Bible is the Council of Nicaea. The fact that it went the way it did is counter to, right? If you were placing bets outside as to which way the council was going to go, the favorite odds were for the Arians, but they lost, right? Arius was exiled and condemned, told to go away, basically, and never come back. And the church's official stance was orthodoxy, right? Okay, we're going to pause. Any questions there?
Did that crush Arianism?
No, not even close. So, this might be a good time to explain the title I have on the top of your papers, right? That is Latin, Athanasius contra mundum. That means Athanasius against the world, right? It's because of what happens after Nicaea. So, what basically happens is a lot of extraordinarily complicated stuff, really intricate politics and craziness, right? We're not going over most of it. I'm giving you the simplified version of it, right? Even though it probably won't sound simplified. By the year 330, so 5 years after Nicaea, Arius basically retreated to the Antiochene sphere of influence, because Antiochene is just Antioch, right? Alexandrian, Antiochene. You sometimes hear people say Antiochian. That's wrong. Drove me nuts in seminary. It's Antiochene. Anyway, he basically fled to that area, which was still willing to kind of harbor him. Remember, they don't just change their minds overnight, even if their bishops had, even though not all of them did. So he kind of flees to friendly territory, gathers support. By the year 330, the bishop of the city of Nicomedia returned from an exile, because he was an Arian bishop. He was exiled. He returns after exile and convinces Constantine. So he goes and petitions Constantine to force Athanasius to reconcile Arius to the church. Athanasius is not willing to do this, right? Because Arius hasn't changed his views on anything. And so the short version of this is Constantine begins to exert pressure on Athanasius, along with Eusebius of Caesarea, right? And that's the bishop of Antioch at this point. They begin to exert pressure, they drum up false charges against Athanasius, and they force him out of his bishopric. Constantine exiles Athanasius to Gaul, right? And Gaul is just modern day France. So Athanasius is forced to flee in the year 335, right? So right before he's forced to flee, he's called to what I refer to as a kangaroo council. It was an official council of the church, although no one recognizes it. It's known as the Council of Tyre in 335. Athanasius basically shows up to this council to defend himself, to defend orthodoxy, and finds basically nothing but Arian bishops there who condemn him as a heretic, condemn him for trumped up charges due to kind of breaking laws related to the bishops, like refusing the chalice to people. It's all trumped up charges, right? And he is exiled to Gaul.
How long was the Council of Nicaea in session?
I want to say it was 3 years, but don't quote me on that. It was more than a year. I do know that. It took a long time to sort everything out. As Athanasius flees from the Council of Tyre on his way to being exiled in Gaul, he flees first to Constantinople, where he does what I think is one of the most stone-cold things of his life. He waits outside the gates of Constantinople. By the way, Constantinople is now the capital of Rome, right? Named after Constantine. Bonus points if anyone knows what it was called, right? Everyone on the internet, at least, is all upset because now it's Istanbul, right? Because like 600 years ago, but anyway, all that kind of stuff. And there's a whole song by There Will Be Giants or something like that. Istanbul, Constantinople. What was it called before Constantinople? Does anyone know?
Byzantium?
Yes, even before that, it had another name now. Byzantium is the original name of the city, which is why it's called the Byzantine Empire, right? But you got to go way back. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So Athanasius waits, basically, this is my version of it, right? I wasn't there. He basically waits in the forest outside of the city of Constantinople. And as Constantine is returning from a hunting trip, he jumps out from behind a bush, grabs the bridle of the emperor's horse and drags it into the forest and says, "We need to talk," right? which is crazy, right? So he is able to convince Constantine that he is innocent of the charges, and he sees the end of his first exile, right? I did say first exile. Contramundum is not one exile. Go ahead, Jay.
Sorry while you're talking.
No, you're good.
Verifying everything. But it says here that 27 books in the New Testament and 39 books of the Old Testament were removed at the Council of Nicaea.
No. We'll talk about that, actually.
Okay, I didn't mean to.
But no, there are people who say that kind of thing was happening. There were secret book. No,
Okay.
that's not the case. But actually, we will talk about, because one of the other major things that happens at the Council of Nicaea is the soft canonization of the scriptures, right? They canonize it, but I say soft because it took a while for everyone to kind of agree, and then there was some misinformation about, well, what did they actually say about it, and we'll get to that. But that's the end of his first exile. And then everything hits the fan in the year 337. That is when Constantine dies. And he does something that is potentially a crime to the empire, but is certainly a crime to historians, in not naming a successor and in what he named his 3 sons, right? So, Constantine's 3 sons are, where are we go? Constantius, and Constantine II. Come on, be creative, my man, right? Name the city after yourself, name all 3 of your sons after yourself, but all just a little bit different. It's a nightmare to keep them separated and to figure out which one's which. We're not really going to sort all this out. Well, what happens when Constantine doesn't name a successor, and then he has 3 sons, all with basically the same name, that all basically come into play? Constantine's idea was to separate out the position of the emperor into more than one person. This actually wasn't his idea. It was Valens before him. I think it was Valens. No, it was Diocletian, which is why it was a 4-way split civil war, and because there were Augusti and then Caesars on each half of the empire. It's a good idea on paper that did not work. And then when it didn't work, Constantine decided to try it again with his kids. And it didn't work. Remember, Rome's in a basically never-ending civil war for centuries, right? So they all start fighting with each other, right? So, pillar of the emperor, gone, right? Pillar of the army, well, we got 3 of those, and we're trying to figure out which one's the one that sticks, right? So, what do you think these guys are going to try and do? Well, let's grab control of that 3rd pillar, right? We'll legitimize ourselves with the church. Oh, and how convenient that the church is still kind of split in 2. That means that 2 of these brothers can each grab a chunk and then basically fight a proxy war in the church against one another for influence, right? So, let's see. I have this written down specifically here somewhere. All exiles are recalled. This includes, everyone. The brothers turn on each other. Constans supports Arius. Constantine II supports Athanasius. And then Constantius supports a group we haven't even talked about called the Homoiousians. Don't worry about it, right? Instead of saying that Jesus is the same substance as the Father, the Homoiousians say that Jesus is a similar substance to the Father. The Homoians and the Homuans, the Homoousians, that's Athanasius. After this, they reconcile and say, you know what, fine, we're close enough, right? It takes a while. Athanasius is dead before it happens, but that's another 3rd party out there that is very relevant in the true full picture, but we don't need, right? Because this is already complicated enough and crazy enough, right? More or less, these brothers start fighting with each other. One gets control and the other gets control. They're fighting over Alexandria and influence over Alexandria. So there's 2 bishops that go back and forth. Athanasius and then the Arian bishop, whose name I don't know. they go back and forth. In the end, Athanasius is exiled 5 times in total. During his life, he was exiled for a total of 17 years. So throughout this time, Athanasius is always considered the Bishop of Alexandria to the Orthodox people there, right? He returns from his final exile 7 years before his death. Everything has settled down. Orthodoxy is winning. Basically, Arianism is collapsing and is falling out of favor, right? Throughout this whole time, Athanasius is writing like a madman against the Arians. Most of what Athanasius writes are polemic works discrediting the Arian position from a theological standpoint. More or less, the Arian theologians can't keep up with Athanasius. He's right, first of all. He's too intelligent, he's too well written, he's too well respected, even by the people that don't like him, that he wins the day, more or less. So his works, his many works against the Arians are very good. I would not recommend reading those to start out with. Read a lot of church fathers and then go back to them, because they are not easy, right? On the Incarnation is a wonderful pastoral work that brings you into the fullness of why Christ became man for the salvation of humanity, right? His works against the Arians are so deep in the weeds and technical and precise and complicated that they are hard to understand. They are really, and they're dense too. So don't start there. Right? Start with his other stuff. And then go read other church fathers and then come back if you're really interested in this kind of thing. During the last 7 years of his life, he's secure in Alexandria. During this time, he writes a number of his works that aren't necessarily against Arius. One of the things he does write is against a new heresy that's popping up right before he dies, known as the Pneumatomachians, which are Arians for the Holy Spirit, basically. And I mentioned this last week. He's tired. You can tell. He's sick of fighting the same fight. And his letter against the Pneumatomachians reads very differently than his letters against the Arians. His letters against the Arians are extremely precise, dense, all those things that I said. His letter against the Pneumatomachians is not less intelligent, but it's more of a, I'm not doing this again. You know what the right answer is. Stop it, right? It's the next generation of fathers that will deal with the problem in a more systematic approach rather than just, the old man telling the young guys to just knock it off, right? Which is more or less what Athanasius does. But one of the works that he writes during this time is a biography. It's one of the first, it's kind of credited as the first, even though it's not the first, hagiography, which is a biography of a saint. His Life of Saint Anthony. If you want a wild ride, read the Life of Saint Anthony. Saint Anthony is one of those guys that walked off into the desert to become a hermit. He's credited with founding monasticism, as I mentioned earlier. Saint Anthony spends most of his life in this book that Athanasius wrote. He knew him personally. Spends most of his life living in graves and old forts, fighting demons and arguing with Satan, and then teaching people near the end. It is a wild ride of a book. It's a lot of fun. You got to take certain things with a grain of salt. It's got a lot of really cool theology in it. And Athanasius does kind of call himself Elijah at the end of it, because it ends with St. Anthony, Elijah, giving Athanasius his mantle, right? And it's very much a parallel to Elijah and Elisha. It's not subtle. It's fair, right? It might be a little self-congratulatory, but it's fair, I would say. So it's a very influential work. It's basically why we know anything about St. Anthony. It's firsthand. Well, he knew the person that he was writing about. He knew him very well. So it's basically a primary source on St. Anthony. St. Anthony, by the way, is another one of these early church fathers that takes what Jesus says super seriously, right? He doesn't castrate himself like Origen did. Were you here last week, Jay? That's a fun story. But St. Anthony was a very rich man, a lot of family wealth, and he went and heard a sermon where Jesus said, or on Jesus saying, give everything away to the poor, and, sell all you have and give it to the poor. And he went home and did it, which his sister, his parents were dead, his sister was not happy about it. He sent his sister to a nunnery, which again, how is there a nunnery if there's no monks? But that's a whole different thing. Anyway, you can read all about it in the life of St. Anthony. If you do, talk to me about it, because like I said, some weird stuff in there. And then Athanasius would die on May 2nd of 373. Again, he is known with the moniker Contra Mundum, Athanasius against the world, because for much of his life it really was the world against Athanasius, or at least it felt that way, right? He had multiple emperors after him, as well as other heavy-hitting bishops that all wanted to get rid of him. But the one thing he would absolutely not do is budge even an inch on the true doctrine of the person of Jesus Christ. Right? Because he could have made all of this go away at the beginning by just reconciling Arius and calling it a day. But he absolutely refused to, even during those 17 years of exile. He was unwilling to go against what he knew to be true, which is a huge legacy thing there. Questions about his life before we actually are going to read something that he wrote. It'll be fun, right? Any questions about the life of Athanasius?
Now, all his books were preserved, right? I mean,
A lot of them, not everything he wrote, but a lot of what
so
Athanasius.
the fires at the library in Alexandria shouldn't have affected his.
We probably lost some things there. We lost a lot at the library when the Library of Alexandria was burned, but a lot of stuff was still around and copied. A lot of the stuff we lost in the Library of Alexandria was more esoteric, kind of off the wall stuff. That wasn't, promulgated widespread. There's also a lot that we would say was lost in the burning of the Library of Alexandria that technically wasn't, but it has been lost since, and if the library stood, it would have stayed. By the way, there's another massive loss of information when another library burned. Does anyone know what it is? It was the Library of Baghdad. It was burned by Tamerlane, or Timur the Lane. Lane came through and burnt the whole thing as he was killing everyone. It said that the river flowed black and red. And the Library of Damascus had a bunch of stuff that had only been at the Library of Alexandria, and that's gone too. So yeah, two tragic library destructions, if you will. Anyway, so good. Anything else? All right, so I'm going to pass out here. This is, so we talked about two of Athanasius' works, On the Incarnation and Life of St. Anthony. This is another one of them. I'll hand them to you and you can pass them around. This is the entirety of it. So I will commend the whole thing to your reading. We're not going to do quite the whole thing, though. This is, it is Athanasius' 39th Easter Postil. He wrote it in the year 367. It was a cyclical letter to the various churches under him as he was bishop of Alexandria on the occasion of Easter. He is in this letter. I think it's actually in the, well, here, I'll read the title, which is that section before 1. Of the particular books and their number, here we go, Jay, which are accepted by the church from the 39th letter of Holy Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, on the Paschal Festival, wherein he defines canonically what are the divine books which are accepted by the church. So the early church is trying to figure out what the books are. There's still some disagreement even after Nicaea. It hasn't quite been nailed down. And this is the oldest list we have of someone trying to say these are definitively the books of the Bible. Like I said, I will I'll commend the whole thing to your reading, but I'd like to start off in paragraph 4. And I'll read it to you while you can read along, right? There are then, of the Old Testament, 22 books in number. Let's pause there. How many books are in the Old Testament?
39.
Yeah, that's not 22, right? Well, let's figure out what's going on, right? For, as I have heard, it is handed down that this is the number of the letters among the Hebrews, their respective order and names being as follows. First is Genesis, then Exodus, next Leviticus, after that Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. All right, that looks the same. We're good, right? Following these, there is Joshua the son of Nun, then Judges, then Ruth. All right, we're still good, right? After these 4 books of Kings, right? How many of you have 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kings in your Bible? All of you do. The 1st and 2nd being reckoned as one book, and so likewise the 3rd and the 4th. What books is he referring to here?
Chronicles.
Not Chronicles.
Samuel.
1st and 2nd Samuel are one book, and then 1st and 2nd Kings are one book in the Jewish tradition, which is what he's preserving here, right? And they are just called the books of the kings, right? It's actually how they're referenced in the Bible. They're the annals of the kings of Israel, right? So 2 books, we have 4 out of it, right? And so likewise the 3rd and the 4th as one book. And again, the 1st and 2nd of the Chronicles are reckoned as one book, right? Okay, so now we're seeing how we're getting our numbers different, right? Again, Ezra, the 1st and 2nd are similarly one book. Who has 1st and 2nd Ezra in their Bible? Nehemiah is 2nd Ezra, right? Again, they were considered one book. After these, there's the book of Psalms, then Proverbs, next Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. Job follows, and here we're going to lose a bunch of them, right? Then the prophets, the 12 being reckoned as one book. What are the 12? What do you call them?
Minor prophets.
The minor prophets. In the Jewish tradition, that's one book. We split them out into 12 books, right? Then Isaiah, one book. Then Jeremiah with Baruch, Lamentations, and the Epistle, one book. All right, so he's combined Jeremiah and Lamentations, and he has 2 books that we don't have. Baruch and Jeremiah's Epistle. We still have these. These are still extant. You can go read them. They're considered apocryphal in our tradition, right? But Catholic Church, you can just read these. They're just in there, right? And that's all one book. Afterwards, Ezekiel and Daniel, each one book, thus far constitutes the Old Testament. So, his Old Testament looks basically identical to ours, with that one exception that he has 2 extra portions on the book of Jeremiah, as he reckons it, right? Which again, you can go read them if you want. In fact, they're, I'm pretty sure, both quoted in the Book of Concord. So 5. Again, and you gotta love how these ancient guys talk, right? Again, it's not tedious, okay? To speak of the books of the New Testament, these are the 4 Gospels, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Afterward, the Acts of the Apostles and epistles, called Catholic. 7, vis-a-vis of James 1, of Peter 2, of John 3. After these, 1 of Jude. All right? So far, is it looking familiar? His order is different, but we have all of those, right? In addition, there are 14 epistles of Paul, written in this order. The first to the Romans, then 2 to the Corinthians. After these to the Galatians, next to the Ephesians, then to the Philippians, then to the Colossians. After these, 2 to the Thessalonians, and that to the Hebrews. And again, 2 to Timothy, 1 to Titus, and lastly that to Philemon. And besides, the Revelation of John. You notice anything in there?
Includes Hebrews as being Paul.
Athanasius is of the opinion that Paul wrote Hebrews. He doesn't question it. He sees it as an obvious thing. Right? When we did Hebrews, we talked a little bit about that. So portions of the early church just said, well, of course Paul wrote Hebrews, right? Even in his day, that was not a universal belief, right? It's my opinion, personally, but who knows? If you really want to know all the opinions, I taught a class on Hebrews. I went through every one of them, including the one off-the-wall opinion that it was Mary, the mother of Jesus, that wrote Hebrews, right? That one was surprising to me. These are fountains of salvation, that they who thirst may be satisfied with the living words they contain. And these alone is proclaimed the doctrine of godliness. Let no man add to these, neither let him take aught from these. For concerning these the Lord put to shame the Sadducees, and said, Ye do err, not knowing the Scriptures. And he reproved the Jews, saying, Search the Scriptures, for these are they that testify of me. Right? So, this is his examination of the biblical canon. Paragraph 7 is very interesting, though. Let's go through that one. But for greater exactness, I add this also, writing of necessity that there are other books besides these not included in the canon, but appointed by the fathers to be read by those who newly join us and who wish for instruction in the word of godliness. The wisdom of Solomon, the wisdom of Sirach, and Esther, by the way, notice where he puts Esther, and Judith and Tobit, and that which is called the teaching of the apostles and the shepherd. But the former, my brethren, are included in the canon, the latter being merely read. Nor is there any place mention of apocryphal writings, but they are an invention of heretics who write them when they choose, bestowing on them their approbation and assigning to them a date, that so using them as ancient writings they may find occasion to lead astray the simple. Right? All right, so let's deal a little bit with this. You guys recognize any of the works that he talks about here as being good to read? Other than Esther, right? Steve, I would imagine you do.
I have not read them, but they're in my wife's Bible.
That's right.
So they're good to read.
A big chunk of these, the wisdom, Sirach, Judith, all that, that's a big portion of what is known today as the Apocrypha, right? Again, most of these are quoted in the Book of Concord. He then also references two others, the teaching of the apostles and the shepherd. I have talked about both of these. Does anyone know what either of these two are? I have them both on my shelf, if you want to read them, by the way. I've read them both. They're excellent. In fact, I referenced one of these in this class today. The teaching of the apostles is also known as the Didache. It's what I quoted in my newsletter article that's coming out in a few days. So you can read the introduction to that in the newsletter article. I mentioned it there. It's possible that the Didache, the teaching of the 12 apostles, predates the New Testament. After Jesus, before New Testament. Really fascinating. Probably not, but it's possible. And then the shepherd is a work known as the Shepherd of Hermas. Jay, so what you were talking about there. There were those at Nicaea, specifically those last two, the Didache and the Shepherd of Hermas, who wanted them included in the canon of Scripture. But the church said no, right? Or the council at large said no. Notice that they're not saying don't read them. They're saying that actually, it's kind of a, once you're done with the Bible, go read those books, right? This is your confirmation curriculum, according to Athanasius, right? If you're new to the faith, read that, and then you will know what we're talking about, right? And so, by the way, the reason those books weren't included in the canon is there's a 3-point criteria written by an apostle, centered on Christ and widespread use in the church. And both of those have reasons why they don't fit that category. By the way, we've talked about this a lot in my class over the years. There's a number of books in the Bible that some people said shouldn't have been in there. And so they are considered like secondary portions of the New Testament. Antilegomena is their official term. If you want to know more about that, go check out my class on Hebrews, because Hebrews is one of them, and we dealt with it extensively when I taught that class. Now, interesting, because at the end, he has a condemnation in there, right? The apocryphal writings, right? Nor is there any place of mention of apocryphal writings. They're inventions of heretics. What is he talking about? Because Steve, your wife will be happy to know he is not talking about what we call the Apocrypha, right? He just said to read most of what we are referring to when we use the word Apocrypha. So what is he talking about when he uses that word?
Something like the Gospel of Thomas.
The Gnostic Gospels. That's what we refer to with that, right? He calls them the apocryphal works, We call them things like the Gnostic Gospels, right? They're heretical works, right? We even saw it, right? Irenaeus. No one agrees with these. No one is even trying to say that these are Christian, right? Not even the Gnostics are, right? But as they are, right? As people want to lead people astray, they parade them out and go full Dan Brown and say, oh, here's the Gospel of Judas in Nicaea. Didn't want you to read this. This is what Jesus really thought. Now, the church has never, forget Nicaea, the church for 200 years before Nicaea has been outright against all of that. And again, the people who were writing them way back when were also not claiming that it was the Bible. So it's not until later that the conflagration begins to happen there. So historically, Jay, yes, you'll hear some people who are being dishonest, academically dishonest, or don't know any better, right? There's two different camps there. Like Dan Brown, he is being when I was an undergrad learning in a secular institution, they were saying this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Like he just is inaccurate just from a basic historical perspective, right? And these were people that would then turn around and tell me just how terrible certain parts of the early church were, right? So these are not academic historians with skin in the game on our side, if you will. They're just, secular historians who say, well, I got other problems with Christians from the early church, but that's not one of them, right? If you've read anything from the time, this is not, it's made up, or it's misunderstood, basically. All right, go ahead, Bill.
What was the form that gave us the current listing of the Old Testament and New Testament?
It's sometimes known as the Council of Jerusalem. The Council of Jerusalem is weird. So we don't have a lot of historical records for it. There's some people who don't think it actually happened. There are some people that conflate it with when Paul and Peter have their argument in public, right, where Paul's like, I withstood Peter to his face because he was saying these things that were wrong. Some people say that the Council of Rome dealt with the heresy of Judaizing, which is basically saying, Paul deals with this a lot, right? To be in the church, you still need to be circumcised. It's the main flashpoint there. The Council of I keep saying Rome, the Council of Jerusalem is where that gets kind of proposed. That's historically a little soft. You go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? They have the canon of the Old Testament there, and that's way before, that's in the intertestamental period. So basically the Old Testament doesn't have one, with the Council of Nicaea and the New Testament, you can say that's the point where the canon gets set, even though that's not 100% true, right? It still needs to be finalized and worked out. There isn't even a place like that we can really solidly point to and say that's when the Old Testament got set, because it happened sometime during the intertestamental period. We don't have any historical records of it. So that one's a little bit harder, right? It can't be after it can't be after Jesus because the Septuagint, it predates Jesus, right? Jesus quotes the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, by the way. So when the Old Testament was formally compiled is not an easy question to answer. Sometime during the intertestamental period, likely a lot of scribes in Alexandria have a lot to do with it. Good. Anything else? Good question, but I don't have a great answer for it. Well done, Bill. All right. Well, next week we're going to push forward where it's going to be interesting because in one way we're going to talk about one thing again, but this one thing is going to have three people. They're three gentlemen, if you will, known as the Cappadocian Fathers, right? So three guys, but they're always lumped together. And we're going to talk about the theology of the Holy Spirit and getting all that sorted out and figured out. So, thank you all for coming. Appreciate you being here. Let us then close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.